We've got Julian in Dusseldorf. How are you?
Yes, hi Matt. Hi Jen.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you, thanks.
Perfect. I love you guys. Great show. And before I forget, Matt, please at some point write a book. I have dozens of friends even in Germany who would buy it right away. Okay, I'll quickly try to state my question or problem so that you can hopefully take some time and elaborate in detail on the subject. Since
Okay.
I have seen most of your previous episodes, and this is a subject that I haven't seen much talk about, even though I believe it is very current, especially in Western countries. Basically, I have been an anti-theist, materialist, and active atheist for a few years now, and I don't have any problems debating religious people or theists for that matter. But I have recently encountered problems when debating so-called spiritual people who come from a rather deistic position and use scientific words such as energy and consciousness in a rather esoteric way. Basically, they start talking about the limitation of reason, and that reason is only one dimension, one level, and that consciousness kind of like goes beyond and is the key to experiencing the world. And they say that everyone perceives reality subjectively. So basically, everyone lives in his illusion of subjective reality, and this illusion, metaphorically speaking, is kind of like a canvas on which we only see the shadows of the objective reality, the reality as it actually is. And evidence for this, to a certain point, is differing preferences, values, and tastes. For example, one person perceives beauty and reality entirely differently, just to give one of their examples. Thereby, everything has a different life, and thereby perhaps different standards of evidence. This extends to the point that truth and science, which is supposed to be objective and is there to filter out mistakes made by our senses, but actually science, they say, is also just applicable in an individual subjective reality. So science can just say something about the world as we perceive it subjectively. And the problem is, just to finish off, that we must, to a certain degree, agree with that, because we don't know for sure that there is perhaps just our own subjective reality or consciousness, as in the philosophy of Solipsism, although I know that probably this would violate Occam's razor. So perhaps, hopefully you can tell me how I should respond to this and argue for a reality of reason and a material worldview.
Sure. I mean, first of all, we're talking about a particular kind of hard version of solipsism. It's, by and large, I find that these people aren't actually worth having a conversation with, because they have this preconception that reality and truth is necessarily subjective, and so and even down to the point where I may not exist, and how frustrating is it for them, for their imagination, to have created someone like me who so vehemently denies the assertions that they're actually making. They want to say that, that all the values are subjective because we have different preferences. Well, the fact that I might like apples over oranges and somebody else might like oranges over apples doesn't change the fact that, to the best of our ability to discern anything, we both live in the same universe that has both apples and oranges. The fact that we have different preferences shows that we have different people. Those aren't truth statements. There's no truth that apples are better than oranges or oranges are better than apples in an objective sense. So the fact that some assessments are subjective doesn't in any way discount the objective reality. But even if there wasn't, even if to the extent that solipsism would be correct, I still have to act as if I'm living, I have no choice but to act as if I'm living in the reality that I experience. And it makes sense that it's shared. And if it's not, I don't care. So the fact that they misuse words like energy and trot out arguments that are, well, you can't prove that, you're not all just a figment of my imagination. You know what? I wish you were a figment of my imagination, because you're right, I can't prove that I'm not, but I don't care. It doesn't impact my life at all, and it in no way leads to your ability to define a truth. So if their argument is that there is no truth, that this is all just subjective opinion and subjective experience, then they cannot get from that to any sort of objective statement. They cannot get to, then therefore my deism is rational. I mean, the best they can do is say that it's rational within my own worldview, and they can't distinguish themselves from the psychopaths that we lock up. Or actually, I probably shouldn't use that word because clinical me, but the crazy people that get locked up. We have a method by which we come together and say, you know what, these views are so divorced from reality, from testable, observable reality, that these people are a danger to themselves and others. And what some of the hard solipsists, like the ones you're talking about, or the spiritual people are doing, are basically beginning with this, well, we can't absolutely know, therefore we don't know anything. No, that's wrong. The fact that we're not absolutely certain about everything doesn't mean we don't have a clue about anything. They may not have a clue about anything, but that doesn't mean the rest of us don't live and operate in a reality that is testable, that is independently confirmable, and even if it's all an illusion, that means you're a figment in my imagination, not the other way around.
Okay, I understand. And if you set aside the argument from Solipsism, what would you say to basically their argument for science not being objective, but science also just being basically applicable in one's individual subjective reality? That's what they said is that logic and reason is fine, and he even said that evolution may have occurred, but basically our methods of investigating, those are also basically subject to our own perception.
This isn't any different from the argument that I addressed. They're just applying it to science. And what they're basically saying is that Jen goes in the laboratory and does a test and gets specific results and publishes it in a journal, and several of us go out and repeat it, and we get consistent results, and we confirm this, and therefore what we appear to see as objective science is actually subjective. We just don't know whose subjective science it is. They're absolutely wrong when it comes to logical reasoning, even if they were right about the solipsism. And that is because identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle are absolute. They're true in all possible worlds and everything. They're not things. I don't want to go back into tag and go down that line. But they can't even begin to reason their claim without those being true. And that is a foundational problem of them trying to begin with this subjective solipsistic view and extend it to everything, because they have to then make use of the logical absolutes, and they can't do that. And if they chuck that out and say that logic's subjective and science is subjective and reality is subjective, I don't want to talk to them. It is a complete waste of time. They have demonstrated that they are divorced from reason, and therefore there is no reasonable argument that can reach them until you demonstrate that it's a really bad idea for them to be reasonable. But how can you do that without reason? These are people who have become enamored of an idea, and these people often fall into the same sort of intellectually elite agnostics who like to pretend that, well, we just don't know, it's absurd. And the fact of the matter is, as unfortunate it is, there are some people that it's just not worth bothering with. If they are not willing to accept reason, you may be wasting your time trying to have a reasonable discussion with them.
Okay, so if the entire world would experience kind of like some sort of deity in their own consciousness, would that then make it real in our shared reality?
I don't know.
You wouldn't know?
I don't know what that is or what that would be or how it would play out, because I can't think of anything that would count as evidence for an actual deity because of the very nature of the question, which is why my answer to when people have asked, what would it take to convince you that a God exists? My answer is now and will be, I have no idea, but I have to think that anything that would qualify as a God should know what it would take to convince me and should be capable of doing it. And until that happens, it's not my responsibility, it's that God's ability. If this is a being that exists transcendentally, that is unnatural, supernatural, whatever, I can't possibly conceive of what it is that could be counted as evidence. Because something that would appear to me to be perhaps divine in nature, I'm relying on my own experience of it, and I cannot assess it objectively. And so we used to say, we said before that, perhaps writing in the sky that was simultaneously viewed by everybody in their own language, even though it was one piece that said, I am the Lord your God, perhaps that might qualify. But in hindsight, I cannot then distinguish the source of that message, whether or not it is a god or a very sophisticated alien intelligence or a mass delusion. Because once mass delusion enters the picture, I may well be one of the deluded, and anybody who can attempt to assess this may be among the deluded. So you're in a position where you cannot confirm anything.
Okay, I understand.
Cool.
And just to finish off, and your justification for basically a materialist worldview, would you go down to just saying that basically everything else is a violation to Occam's razor, and that neuroscience basically points to there only being our brain that produces our consciousness, or do you have any sort of other explanation that I could use?
Well, I think that neuroscience clearly points to the brain being the source of consciousness, and the fact that if you damage someone's brain, through an accident or some kind of organic process, then their perception of themselves and the world around them changes.
Okay.
Well, you asked about.
I mean, we have a lot of examples in the case of Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia, where if you damage a specific part of the brain, you get a marked personality change, and essentially a loss of who that person really is.
So
Okay.
you asked about materialist, and I'll rephrase it in terms of naturalism, and that there's two different aspects of this. There's philosophical naturalism, which is the philosophical position that nothing but the natural world exists, and then there's methodological naturalism, which is what science makes use of, and it's a matter of pure practicality, that the natural world is all that science is capable of actually investigating, and therefore that's all it can actually make any statements about. And in my case, I don't necessarily assert that the natural world is all that exists, although I think that's very likely to be true. I'm open to any of it. I'm more along the lines of methodological naturalism. When you ask specifically about the brain and the mind, it's possible to assert that there's a ghost in the machine, that there's some sort of spirit pulling the strings, but everything we've learned about the brain demonstrates that not only is that hypothesis unnecessary, but it's most likely not true. Because we can reboot people's brains. We can change their personalities, their memories, their desires. Every bit of evidence we have demonstrates that who I am is what my brain does, and that this can be changed in a purely physical aspect. And so I find no room for any soul. What happens? Does the soul get rebooted along with the brain? When I have a split brain patient and they form two personalities, do we get two different souls? I don't know what's going on there, and it seems to me that we should have outgrown this idea, but it's just such a wonderful, warm, fuzzy thing to talk about soulmates and living forever, and you touched my soul as a form of metaphor, that it lingers. And in some cases, I don't mind it. I've talked about the poetic human spirit before, and I don't believe that there's a spirit in any individual or in the collective. But poetically, I don't mind it. But it does keep alive the more literal, kind of arguments and claims.
Right.
Anyway, thanks a lot, Julian. I appreciate the call.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thanks.
Cheers.